I first laid eyes upon the crow painting in the grand hall of the guest house. The room was filled with an unsettling silence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It wasn't the vibrant colors that drew me in, nor the masterful brushstrokes. There was something more, something that seemed to call out to me. It was the crow's eye, a deep blood-red eye that seemed almost alive. It seemed to pierce through me as if it could see into my very soul, to know my deepest fears and desires. The sensation was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The crow seemed to beckon me closer, its gaze unrelenting, to whisper secrets only I could hear. The whispers were faint, almost inaudible, yet they resonated deeply within me. I felt a strange pull towards the painting, an inexplicable fascination. It was as if the painting had a life of its own. It was unsettling, yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. The more I stared, the more I felt drawn into its dark depths. There was a darkness in the crow's stare, a malevolence that sent shivers down my spine, a premonition of something sinister lurking beneath the surface of the seemingly charming guest house. The air grew colder and the shadows seemed to lengthen. Alistair tried to dismiss it as his imagination, a trick of the mind, the result of a long journey and the anxieties of being in a new place. But the feeling of unease was persistent. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. It took root in his mind, growing with each passing moment. The crow's image lingered in his mind, haunting his thoughts, a harbinger of the horrors that awaited him within the walls of the guest house. The night was just beginning, and so were the terrors that lay ahead. The cooks, the seemingly hospitable proprietors of the guest house, insisted on upgrading Alistair to their finest room, Room 7. It was an act cloaked in generosity, a gesture intended to make him feel welcome. But Alistair couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Their smiles seemed strained, their eyes holding a veiled secret behind their pleasantries. The insistence on Room 7 in particular felt like a carefully orchestrated move, a subtle push towards something I couldn't quite grasp. Alistair hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to refuse. Yet he found himself agreeing, accepting their offer with a forced smile. He dismissed his unease as irrational paranoia. Little did he know he was stepping into a carefully laid trap, one that would lead him down a path of unimaginable terror. Left alone, Alistair explored his new room, his fingers trailing over the antique furniture, the heavy velvet curtains. It was then he discovered it, a beautiful, ornately carved music box, tucked away in a dusty corner. Curiosity piqued, I reached out and opened it. A haunting melody, both beautiful and melancholic, filled the air. The tune struck a chord deep within me, a feeling of both familiarity and aching sadness. It was a tune I had almost forgotten, a melody from a past life, a life I shared with my late wife. The music box, a relic from a happier time, now served as a cruel reminder of his loss. The sweet melody that once brought him joy now pierced his heart with a bittersweet ache. It was a tangible connection to his past, pulling him deeper into the clutches of grief and despair. As night fell, the guest house took on a different demeanor. The silence was broken by strange noises, scratching sounds within the walls, the floorboards creaking under unseen weight. A cold draft seemed to seep through the room, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Sleep eluded me. I lay awake, my senses heightened, every creak and groan of the old house amplifying my unease. The whispers seemed to grow louder, the unseen presence in the house making itself known. Fear gnawed at the edges of his mind. He tried to rationalize the sounds, attributing them to the age of the house, but deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The guest house was alive, and it was watching him. Night after night, I was tormented by the incessant noises and a growing sense of dread. The silence of the night was shattered by whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Sleep became an elusive dream, replaced by a relentless cycle of exhaustion and paranoia. Each night I would lie awake, my mind racing with thoughts that spiraled out of control, leaving me more drained with each passing hour. The crow in the painting seemed to mock me with its knowing stare, its blood-red eye a constant reminder of my unraveling sanity. It felt as though the painting was alive, watching my every move, feeding off my fear. The lack of sleep chipped away at my resolve, my grasp on reality weakening with each passing hour. My thoughts became jumbled, and I found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. The line between what was real and what was a figment of my sleep-deprived mind blurred. My reflection in the mirror seemed foreign, distorted, as if I was looking at a stranger. I became a prisoner in my own mind, haunted by the whispers, the shadows, the growing certainty that I was not alone. The walls seemed to close in on me, and every creak and groan of the house felt like a sinister presence lurking just out of sight. The guest house had become his tormentor, a place of psychological torture that preyed on his fears and vulnerabilities. What was once a refuge had turned into a nightmarish prison. The once charming facade had crumbled, revealing the true nature of the house, a sinister entity that fed on the despair of its inhabitants. It was as if the house itself was alive, thriving on the misery it inflicted. One night, at the height of his delirious state, he saw her, his wife. She stood at the foot of his bed, bathed in an ethereal glow. Relief washed over him, followed by a surge of longing and sorrow. But as I reached out to her, my blood ran cold. Her eyes, once filled with love, now held an empty, haunting gaze. Her skin was deathly pale, her touch icy cold. This was not my wife, but a twisted apparition, a cruel mockery of the woman I loved. Terror gripped him. He recoiled from her touch, his heart pounding in his chest. The music box, still playing its melancholic tune, suddenly seemed to amplify the horror of the situation. It was no longer a comforting reminder of his past, but a conduit for something sinister. In a fit of desperation, driven by the sheer terror that consumed him, Alistair grabbed the music box. He slammed it against the wall, the force of the impact shattering the delicate wood and silencing the haunting melody. The room fell silent, the ghostly apparition of his wife vanishing into thin air. He stood there panting, his hands shaking, surrounded by the wreckage of the music box. A strange sense of calm washed over him, the silence deafening after the incessant whispers and the haunting melody. But the silence was short-lived. The scratching sounds within the walls resumed, louder than before, filled with a rage that chilled him to the bone. The house was angry, its vengeance swift and merciless. A new wave of terror washed over Alistair as he realized the true extent of his predicament. He had become a prisoner in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. He stumbled back from the shattered music box, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. The door slammed shut, the lock clicking ominously. He was trapped at the mercy of whatever malevolent force now controlled the guest house. Panic surged through him, fueling his desperation. He had to escape, to break free from the clutches of this nightmare. But the more he struggled, the more hopeless his situation became. The house had him trapped, both physically and mentally. Just when Alistair thought the horror couldn't escalate any further, he heard a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. A slow, deliberate rapping on the door, accompanied by the sickeningly sweet voices of the cooks. But their voices were distorted, twisted into something grotesque and inhuman. He pressed his back against the wall, his eyes wide with terror as the doorknob slowly turned. The door creaked open, revealing the cooks, their faces contorted into horrifying masks of malice. Their once warm smiles were stretched into grotesque parodies, their eyes gleaming with an unholy light.
They were no longer the kindly proprietors he had first encountered. The facade had fallen away, exposing the true monsters lurking beneath. They were creatures of nightmare, their true forms as twisted and horrifying as the house they inhabited.
Driven by primal fear, Alistair threw himself at the monstrous figures, catching them off guard. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought with every ounce of strength he had, the darkness around him seeming to close in tighter with each passing second. He bolted through the doorway, racing down the hallway, the cook's enraged shrieks echoing behind him. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching out like grasping hands trying to pull him back into the nightmare. He didn't dare look back. his only thought survival. Every step felt like a battle against the fear that threatened to paralyze him. He burst out of the guest house and into the night, the cool air stinging his lungs as he gasped for breath. The stars above seemed indifferent to his plight, twinkling coldly in the vast, uncaring sky. He didn't stop running until he reached the old well at the edge of the property. The ancient stones felt cold and unyielding under his hands as he clung to them, desperate for a moment of safety. He scrambled down into its depths, seeking refuge in the darkness. The air was damp and musty, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the horrors above. He crouched there, hidden from view, his heart pounding against his ribs. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space, each creak and rustle a potential threat. The silence was broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing, and the distant, haunting melody of the music box carried on the wind. It was a chilling reminder of the terror that still lurked just beyond his hiding place. It seemed to follow him, a constant reminder of the horrors he had endured and the madness that still clung to him. The melody was like a ghost, haunting his every step, a sinister lullaby that refused to let him go. He was free from the guest house, but the nightmare was far from over. The shadows of his past still loomed large, and the melody lingered, a dark symphony that played on in his mind.